All right, so in this session, we are going to do both a cursory and a deep dive into scripting. The goal is to try and bring all the stuff that we've talked about from the content library, playlisting, and templates all together into functionally building scripts that put content out into the world. So, first and foremost, we're going to go into the Script Management tab of Cisco Vision. The first thing that you'll notice, and again, we touched on a couple of these things briefly during our tour of the system. All of the scripts in the system will show up on the left-hand side. You can actively see the state of the scripts, what they're currently doing. If you select a particular script, you can identify where in the sequential states that script is currently occupied. But what we're going to do is jump into the demo script that we have set up here. So, once we select our script, we'll go to the Edit button, hit the Edit button, take a look at what we've got going on. So, the left-hand side, under Sequential States, each one of these is a separate set of actions that can be assigned to the same or a different set of groups of DMPs. Once again, we talked about the fact that, as a best practice, we have a blank state to begin with. No groups are involved in this state. It's just a timer to let the DMPs that are a part of the script get their programming before we move on to the first content or action states. TV on state is actually a completely non-content-based state, and there are a bunch of those. So what we'll start by doing is we'll look at, and we're going to remove the existing zone so that we can see this from the get-go. So we have a state, we've named it TV on. If we hit the Edit button, we can look at the details of the state's configuration. It has a name, you can assign it a description if you want to, and then again, you've got a choice between a manual state or a timer state. If the timer state is selected, then whatever you identify for the duration, once this state starts, it'll allow that amount of time to pass before it moves on to the following sequential state. It always goes from top to bottom. So in this case, blank, TV on, 15 seconds passes, we go to the background state. So we've removed all of the configuration for the state details now. So we're going to start from scratch. We're going to add the configuration into this script state. So if we go into the center panel to state details, we can select Add, and then search for the zone that we want to include. Now, all groups have to be a part of zones, and we'll talk about that when we get into grouping and zoning. So when you import groups and zones into a script state, you do it by zone, not by group. So we'll look at the demo zone here. If I drop this down, we'll notice that the demo group is a child object of the demo zone. But we're going to go and import demo zone, and you'll see that you have both available. When you've imported groups and zones into a script state, you can apply actions either on the zone or on the group or both. And let me just describe the difference in what that means. If you put an action on a zone level, it will apply to every group inside of that zone unless the group has its own action. So let's say that you had a club space, Pachanga for example, and let's say that you'd broken up the Pachanga club into bar TVs, video walls, and projectors, and you put them all in the same zone. You could say, I want everything to run the logo loop, and you put that on the zone, except the bar TVs you actually want to run an L wrapper. So you apply the action to the zone, 2 of the 3 groups will inherit their action from the zone, and then the third you'll put something on directly. I'll show you an example of that here after we get through just a simple example. So demo zone, we're going to click on the demo group. We'll hit Edit, which opens up the action for that group. Everything on the left that you see is either a template or an action that we can apply to a group or a zone. Each of these, for example, like 1x2 A1 and B1, those are the templates for a 1x2 video array for the upper and the lower displays. The 3x3s look like what you expect them to, scene or side-eye activation, the individual templates for concessions. So we just want to power the TV on. So we're going to go down to the TV on state, double click it, you'll see that it moves from available up into assigned. And in this case, it's just an action that has no template associated with it. So you can just hit OK and confirm that now, under demo group, in the actions column, you see what you've assigned to that group. We'll hit save, and that commits the change into the script. Now, I'm going to add, we're going to move on to another state just for a reference point. So we'll go into the background state. You'll see that here, the demo background that you see running is actually running at the zone level, which means that the demo group inherits it and plays out the same content. If we hit add, we're going to just pick something that has multiple groups in it. Good call would be here, this tour setup script, for example, right? We actually have 3 different groups in that zone. And so I'll show you practically. Let's say that we want to do full screen video. So again, we're going to the zone, edit, available actions. We'll type full screen video or mixed because we want to play a video channel. So we have to make sure that our region is a video region. There's only one region in this template, which is selected here, region 1. And then we'll go into channels and identify a channel that we want to assign. In this case, we'll put in the logo loop. Double click to add it, OK to commit, save, adds it to the script. So now all 3 of these groups, when we get to this background state of the script, are going to play the same logo loop channel as a part of that script. But let's say that on one of these 3 groups we want different content. Well, all we have to do is select that group and apply a separate action for that group. So let's call it overlay. In overlay, we have 2 regions. We have a background video region and then a bug that'll sit over on top of it. So let's give this a channel. Let's say ESPN. And then we'll use, you'll see that we have far fewer static non-video playlists than we do video playlists because we just haven't had a lot of templates that use them. So we'll double click on demo overlay. That populates it. And so take a look at the actual center here where it says logo overlay configuration. You'll see that the regions show the content that has been added to populate it on the physical layout of the template. So channel ESPN, region bug, demo overlay group. We can confirm that here because we see that on this group, we've sent the logo overlay action, which uses the logo overlay template, and that in region 1, which is our main video region, we're playing ESPN. Region 2, our demo overlay, which is the bug that sits over the bottom right-hand corner. So when you run this state, these 2 groups will run the content assigned to the zone, but this one, which has its own specific content, will run its own content.
Are there any limitations on how many groups you could have on a specific state? Like if you were to keep adding?
Not really.
You can go as much as you want?
The only thing that I would make a note about is the more groups that you add into one script, the more likely you are to encounter errors in the script that will cause a blocking event. So you have to be a little bit more careful about what you've got running. Whereas if you break it up into more individual scripts that have fewer overall groups in them, typically you can start and stop those scripts without worry, like you're not going to impact every space in the building simultaneously. There are benefits to doing it both ways, but like a big monolithic script, if you had to make a change, you have to stop that script, tear down content for every TV in that big monolithic script, make the change, and then push it out again. So as a note, like if you're talking a game day event, for example, if you wanted something running in every single club, you could run a club script, but if you have to make a change in just one of the many clubs, the content would have to be pulled down for all of those clubs before you could make any change to the script. Now, another caveat related to that, just because you have to stop the script to change the script Doesn't mean that you have to stop the script to change the content. You can do dynamic updates to playlists while a script is running without changing it. So if you had to add an asset into rotation for a playlist for an L wrapper, you can add that into the playlist from the content management tab in the library without stopping the script. It'll just ask if you want to force the change or if you want to wait until the script is rerun. And if you say force the change, it'll push that content out to the DMPs, update the playlist, and when it gets to the point in the playlist where the new content was added, it'll play back correctly.
So in terms of script validation, I know that a script won't override another running script. So
Yes.
how would you suggest going about having an emergency message? Let's say I need to trigger a message across the entire venue because something bad's happening. And there's no way to override running scripts.
Mm-hmm. So the way that we would do that is with an emergency state, and we're going to talk about that here.
Okay.
Right. So essentially, like ad hoc and emergency states both do the same thing, but an emergency state would be done specifically for emergency event messaging, and I can show you how we'll accomplish that goal.
Okay.
So main piece here, the takeaway is inheritance of actions on zones versus groups. Any questions about that so far? Okay, cool. And so we don't need to keep this in the script, so we'll get rid of it for now. Now the one thing I do want to do is go through the list of stock options that are available as an action to apply to a particular group or zone. So all of these, for the most part, are templates that have been created in your system. If you ever find that you don't have a template that fits what you need it to, you can always create one in the template editor. It will show up here after you save it. So like, for example, we did our demo template. Our demo template is now available to us. We would delete the existing action and then double click to add the new one. And so this is that same overlay template that we were just playing with earlier in the demo on the template editor. And those two regions become available for us to populate with playlists. So Joey, to get back to your question from earlier, does this make sense about how now playlists, groups and zones, and scripts and templates all interact with each other?
Yeah, a group goes into a zone.
Yep. And then you put an action on that group in a script state. And then the action is the template, and then the template gets playlists.
Say that one more time.
So you put DMPs in groups. Groups go into zones. You can put an action on a group or a zone, which is typically a template, and then the regions of the template get assigned playlists.
Makes sense.
Cool. So now if we just take a quick step back out, we can look at all of the templates that are built in this environment. So if you've got different types of video wall configurations, those video walls each need to have a distinct individual template so that they can scale multicast across a 2x2 array or a 3x3 array. Default 3-region L wrapper we looked at before, but we can add that here. And that's with that center video region, an add region, and a ticker region. So this is a full screen dual video. This would involve like an overlay L wrapper, exactly the way we discussed before, using a Luma key channel to add transparency. This template accomplishes that goal. The full screen non-video, that's if you have static signage, that would point to a non-video playlist.
Can you go back to dual video for just 1 second?
Sure.
So you only actually see region 2 within the box. So when you apply something to video 1, it's in the background, but you don't physically see it.
So it does actually show up.
Transition.
Yeah, it's because you'll actually see, I don't know if it's clear, but so the text for region 1 and region 2 are overlaid on top of each other. So this is video 1. And then if I go ahead and add a different channel here, you'll see that it just puts it on both. So if I delete, you'll see that shows up.
Got it. So the other layer appears once you assign content to it. overlap.
Correct.
Got it. Okay.
And so typically, your video 1 region would be some kind of a video stream. So let's say, for example, SoFi in-house 1. And then video 2 would typically be a playlist of advertising assets. So you click over to playlists, you'd look for, I don't think I have a wrap, but we can just add, some playlist of other things. And then once you hit OK, you can just, again, always confirm that you see the appropriate playlists in each one. So region 1, channel SoFi in-house 1, region 2, Cedar Sinai 2x2. Right?
Oh, I see. So you can prove it here because in the other page, it's hard to read.
Correct.
Got it.
Yeah, it's much easier to see on the layout page when every region is physically distinct. It's only an issue specifically for the dual full screen template. So, and then from here, you can continue down past the full screen template. So full screen vertical would apply to a device that's set with a rotation. We'll talk a little bit about the configuration for DMP rotation when we get into the system configuration, but once you rotate a display, it's treated like it's a 1080 by 1920. It's tilted on its side. So
this is a good point. So for the verticals right outside, for example, you could either set a custom configuration with that vertical layout, or you have the content just designed sideways, right?
Correct.
And that's what we did out there.
Yes. The only downside to that is multicast video will, if you want multicast to turn so that it shows in the correct orientation, you pretty much have to put something into a vertical orientation. Because you've got no way of sending 1080 by 1920 from an encoder. Right?
Okay.
And then, a good example of that would be you could build a region where the top portion of your screen, oriented vertically, was your game feed. And then below, you could carve that up into any number of advertising assets. Or, move your multicast region further down into the middle of the screen and have branding below and above it. Well, there are a lot of different ways to use that, but the main piece is if you want your multicast video to show up in that vertical orientation, the display has to be turned by -90 or +90, and you've got to use a template that is 1080 by 1920 instead. But yeah, for sure, you can just generate 1920 by 1080 content that's oriented so that it looks correct. The one that gets used very frequently, the full screen video or mixed, is really like the default template for full screen content, because you can put static images in here, you can put video in here, you can put multicast in here. That's your workhorse template. You'll just use it for all kinds of stuff. And in fact, typically, when I'm putting a script together very quickly, I will often just type full, double-click the one that's at the bottom as a nice quick one. Then continuing down, So the logo overlay, for example, that was the template that we're using for the state that I showed you before with the AmpThink bug on top of it. You can make your bug region any resolution that you want in the template editor. But when it shows up here, you just have to make sure that you map it to the appropriate playlist for the script state.
So, for example, Cedar Sinai.
Yep.
They have those 3x3s that are kind of tilted or whatever, and then the content is streaming across all 6. How did you script that? Where did that go?
So that actually, originally it was going to be a single file that was spread out across the region, but it actually is just this portion of the campus. So that's easier to look at in the template editor, so we'll just pull that up real quick. Yeah, so that's just the full video region. But if we go into the A1 position, is always the one that doesn't really show you anything because it's typically at the origin for 0, 0. And so here you can see exactly what it is. So the full video canvas is 4136 by 2789, and that's just the portion of it that we render out.
So you're just offsetting it to where the first one stopped?
No. So this is, so you see that there's a bar at the top. So you know how that is not like a 2x2. It's got the offset. The offset is baked into the template here, right?
Oh, I see.
Yep.
I gotcha.
And there's no way of visualizing all 4 like screens in the template at the same time, but if you saw each template lined up, you would see how the offsets all fit together. So if we look at the B2 position, you'll see it is in the bottom right-hand corner, right? So we'll hit close. So here's our B2 position. Oh, sorry, it's the other side. It's the A side. A side B2. And that's in the bottom corner. Because the screen orientation on the A side and the B side are mirrored, so you actually have to have 2 separate sets of templates because they're carving out slightly different chunks of the content depending on what side they're running. And then the same thing if you look at the 3x2, it's also just offset based on the positioning of the screens. And the whole point is you build a canvas that is the full size of the video that you're going to play, and you just move the canvas so that just the portion of the video that you want to render on your particular DMP is in that chunk of the template. And we can even look here. So we'll look at the Sinai activation for a second to give you an example. So if we go into this script, so you'll see here we don't actually have any actions on the zone for the most part because you can't put the same template on any of the locations. So in this case, each group gets its own action. The action is just running the content, right? And it's unique to each position. So now we'll go back to the demo.
So the naming convention was background here, and on Cedar Sinai it was action. Building these custom.
The templates? Yeah. Any location that needs a separate template, you just have to build it unique for that location. So then separately from that, the other stuff that we need to take a look at real quick. So send an RS-232 command. This actually is, you can stack this action with a display action, but you could just send change an input, a mute, a power on off. Basically, any command that's configured for the display spec, you can send directly via script action. So if you needed to mute TVs, you could mute TVs here. But yes, literally anything that you've defined an RS-232 command for in your display spec, you can run through a script just through here. And then you can take that RS-232 command or a power on or off command, and then also add a separate presentation template, right? You can just add it.
So I'm noticing on the RS-232 you have video wall on and off. Does that work outside of the Crestron processor?
No, it does not.
Okay.
So the video wall on and off concept was, so like on the Samsung video wall displays, right, there's a native cascading video wall setting that can be enabled. This actually applies to the Raiders environment a little bit more because if you go into the stadium, if you go to the sideline clubs, those like 3x3 and 4x4 arrays, those are actually set up using Samsung's video wall cascade. And that can be enabled or disabled using an RS-232 command. So in your environment, because you've got a DMP whose control cabling is directly connected to the video wall, that actually applies. In our case, there are no DMPs directly behind those video walls. so you don't have direct RS-232 control over them at all anyway. So it's sort of a moot point. It would have to go through a Crestron. But if you had a video wall array with a dedicated DMP, or at least one in the A1 position, which is typically the lead position for Samsung's video wall application, then you could 100% send out that command and get a response from it. And we can just look through, I mean, so on and off, pretty straightforward. Mute is typically a toggle command, but it could also be a discrete mute on, mute off. Input 1 through 4. Some of these, like, they shouldn't give you access to some of these, and I'm not sure why they show up. Like the input 1 name, for example. It's not an RS-232 command. It's a string that describes what the name of the input is. But the input commands are input 1, 2, 3, and 4. So, you know, if you know that for a Samsung, you know, you have every DMP on the same HDMI port, you could hypothetically send out to every DMP in a group, hey, set this to HDMI 1, and that confirms that every device is on the appropriate input. This could also apply for like running a conference room script where you wanted, or running an immersive script for the suites, right? Just send out to the A4 position, you know, set it to input 2, and that just automatically turns on the immersive for the space. So that has some use. Most of these are not. Mute toggle, again, that's just mute on and off, which can be useful. The individual volume commands don't apply for Samsungs because they use discrete up and down, but the volume up and down 100% does. What else applies? That's really mostly it. It's setting the HDMI inputs, setting the volume, pushing it up and down, muting, unmuting, and power. Those are usually the applications of RS-232. And when we get into the configuration for the display spec, I'll actually show you where these are physically configured so that you can see, you know, if you send an on, it's based on the display spec assigned to the specific location in DMP. So even if you've got different types of displays in one group, doesn't matter, it's going to send whatever is in memory for the specific DMPs. So you can send it to a bunch of different TV types all at the same time through one group.
Underneath available actions, what is quad with control?
Where what?
Right there in the available actions.
Oh, that's getting into the quad split thing. Keep in mind, I'll show you this again. It is not fully functional or supported. I did a demo with you for the quad split, right?
A while back, yeah.
Yeah. So I'll open this up real quick. Basically, the deal with this is we've set 2 video regions. One of them is an HTML page that is tuned to 3 separate video multicast IPs. And then there's a primary video region that is just another channel that you're running. It doesn't really function. To my knowledge, this is being roadmapped into 6.4, but I have not yet had like an EFT or any interaction with like a version of the quad split that's actually baked into Cisco Vision. So take any use of quad video with a grain of salt. But so for you guys who haven't actually had any exposure to the quad split thing, basically like on Cisco Vision Plus, we put a website, right? And in the website, we put 4 different multicast addresses, and they render in 4 separate quadrants. It kind of works. It's a little on the clunky side. It's very manual, and it doesn't always do exactly what you expect it to. But it is something that we could hypothetically, you know, get rolling in HQ or in the stadium. But I know that's been a high priority for, you know, like Matt and crew to get running. That's why 6.4 is really the target. But there's a like pre-production version of it that exists. So. The next things that really matter from an action perspective, and these are not templates, are start display streaming. This is the action that lets you start an encoder, right? So remember before we were talking about how you can define a DMP encoded channel? This is how you build a script to run that DMP encoder, right? So each one of these 4 represents a DMP encoded channel that we've configured in the channel guide. And if I select this and I set that as my script action, then when I run a script against a DMP in a group, that DMP is going to start streaming that channel out, right? You have to be a little bit careful with this because you only ever want one DMP streaming a channel at a time, or you're going to get some very funky stuff out in the production environment. But this is where that gets defined. HDMI in streaming. This basically is saying, so understand the difference between display streaming and HDMI in. HDMI in is you're passing through the input to the HDMI in port on the DMP and then turning that into multicast. But you can also stream a presentation that's scripted out, right? So you could run, you could like run an LWrapper, for example, and then instead of running an independent LWrapper on every single TV, you turn it into a multicast channel. And then it's just a single source, and it can be subscribed to by any other media player. So that's just, it turns whatever the DMP is currently playing into a multicast channel. Not nearly as common, because you would usually run that from the management dashboard and not from a script action, but you could do it here too.
And then one more thing on that display.
Yeah.
How did you get into the panel?
What?
How did you get that into the panel? Because right now in South, in the Hall of Fame Club, it's on the panel where I can select the heading code.
That's the channel guide piece.
That's him doing
Well, no. So once we create that channel, right? Like any multicast channel in the environment, you add it to a channel guide, right? So there is a channel guide for that club that includes that channel. And when the Crestron polls based on the pin for the space, it'll get all of the valid channels associated with that pin and that channel guide, right? But just because it's on the panel doesn't mean that it's actually in the environment, right? If you don't have a DMP that is actively publishing that stream, even though the Crestron will see the channel and you can push that channel out to other DMPs, it'll freeze because there won't be any actual video there. And the Crestron has no way of knowing whether or not there's valid content on the stream, right? Next thing that's really useful here is the start web application. This just basically allows you to tune a URL directly to a group of DMPs. So you've got two choices if you want to send out web-based content to DMPs. You can either create a channel that points to that URL, or you can run this start web application. The one thing that's really important to note is that if you run a start web application, you also have to run a stop web application before you really do anything else on that DMP. That action is absolutely required, or it's just going to get stuck on the content that you are running. And then the other thing to note, obviously, power on and off do exactly what you would expect. The command will find whatever the power on RS-232 is and send it. This is identical to sending a power on command using the RS-232 that we looked at earlier. They do the same thing. And then the last piece, user control on and off. Basically, you can adjust whether or not the DMP will respond to user control. You can fix a particular group of DMPs to only respond to script control if you want to disable their ability to be controlled externally. A good example would be if you had like blackouts for a concert where you were contractually obliged to have no content running, you might want to run like, okay, disable control, run a blackout screen, you know, or like a low vision message. That would be the typical application for something like that. And that, apart from the custom templates that you build for your specific venue or environment, really is everything that you can do from an action perspective in a script. So templates, sending some commands, set some streaming stuff. That's the general overview. Any questions about actions in a script? Okay. And that's really the way all of this works. You have a set of sequential states. Those states have groups and zones. Those groups and zones have actions applied to them. And they're all in order. When you run your script, it starts at the top. If there are timers, it ticks all the way down until you hit the first manual state. And every one of these can be run independently. What we haven't talked about are ad hoc states. Ad hoc states are states that interrupt a previous state, but don't stop that state. So if I go from background to URL, if these two states both had a presentation with a long playlist of ads, when I start that state, it just starts at the playlist's starting point, whatever the first item is in the playlist. And it'll play it all the way through or until I stop it with a state change. If I go back to the original state, it starts that playlist back from item number 1, unless the state that I move to is an ad hoc state. An ad hoc state interrupts the state that you were in to play some amount of content, and when it's done, it puts you right back to exactly where you were in the playlist before you started the interruption. So that's one of the reasons why it's really useful for an emergency state, right? If you had a situation where you had to push an emergency message out to the building, it would pause the current running state, and then when it returned, it would go right back into the spot in the playlist where you were before without any interruptions. Ad hoc states can be set with a timer. An ad hoc state with a timer, when it reaches the end of the timer, will transition back to the original state that it was a part of. An ad hoc state that is manual will stay in that ad hoc state until you trigger out of it. So I'll show you an example of this now. So if we look here, this demo script has a trigger. That trigger will play a video, and after 4 seconds, jump right back to the same content that we were running previously. And the same concept would apply if you were running an emergency message.
So this goes hand in hand with SCORE. So
Yes.
you've got the triggers, and then you do the API trigger.
Correct. Basically, so there's an ad hoc state, and then that ad hoc state, you don't start by pushing the button in Cisco Vision. You start it by running an external trigger. And we will talk more about how the triggering actually physically works and the difference between input and output triggers. But the main piece is the triggers work directly with your scripts to initiate, start, stop content, etc. And you can't trigger anything that isn't built into a script. So if you wanted to trigger something, you have to have a script that it either triggers to start and then does something, or it's already running and you trigger something in the already running script. So now if we take a look here, we can actually also, I'm going to stop the script that we have here. So you can navigate your script pretty much in any direction that you want to. We can run back to our blank state. We can move to the ad hoc state. We can move to this video with an overlay. We can transition back to, go to a URL. We can transition into just a logo loop. So you can go through and trigger these states through the Cisco Vision script management page without needing to go in order. But if you're setting up timers, the biggest thing to note is that timed scripts always go from the top to the bottom. You can also modify a script to add a timer while it's running. So if I go here, click timer, and I move this to 15 seconds, and hit save, it will start ticking down, and then it'll eventually move on to the URL state. Awkwardly waiting 15 seconds for a thing to do what I want it to do. And so you've just basically added an additional timer. This can be really useful if you don't have a breakdown for an event where you know exactly what the timing is going to be, and then the breakdown comes out while the script is already running. You can just add a timer that hits whatever the transition period is and does that automation.
And that ad hoc trigger that's sitting off to the right, that could be triggered over any state that's there, right?
You got it. So we're running in the URL. We're interrupting the URL. And then we'll go here. Yep, any state that you've got, interrupt with an ad hoc trigger. And then you can do the same thing with an emergency state. It'll function exactly the same way.
So there's no benefit, what's the benefit of using an emergency state as opposed to ad hoc state? What's the difference?
There really isn't. Yeah. You can do it in either way. I mean, ultimately the process would apply. What you do is if you have a building-wide set of scripts, you could create a uniform emergency script for a trigger. And in that trigger, you would just say, every time you build a new script, you add an additional action for that trigger that adds that new script and the triggering of the emergency state into it. And so like typically it would be like a mute all, right? You'd run like a mute all, play out the emergency message.
All right, so let's say the stadium is it's game day. The stadium is all configured to the program.
Yeah.
In order to activate an emergency message, I still have to start some kind of script.
You would have to have a script running, correct. There's no concept of running any kind of an emergency message without a script running.
Right, so I basically would have to make sure I have a script that's created with all the endpoints in it,
Yep.
minus a couple site signage or whatever,
Yep.
and just have it ready for an emergency ad hoc trigger, and I have to activate that script in order for it to apply.
Yeah, and so usually the logic is you have an idea of an entire game day rundown. That game day rundown will be all public-facing areas that you'd be expected to run emergency messaging in, would be a part of some kind of a script or a series of different scripts, right? And all you have to do is make sure that every script that runs as part of that rundown has that state, and that the trigger that's going to initiate the emergency state includes that action for all of those scripts.
So I still have to stop all existing scripts before activating that script?
No. What you do is you just add, so like, let's say you have a separate script for each of your club spaces, right? You just add an emergency state into each of your club space scripts, and then on your trigger, to actually trigger the emergency, you just add new trigger actions, one for each of those scripts.
Oh, I see.
And it'll be a little bit more clear when we go in to talk about how the triggering actually works and how you set up actions. I think it'll make more sense about how that mechanism like functions.
Okay.
And that's really, I mean, that's 100% of how scripting functions top to bottom. That's the inheritance. This is where everything comes together. Your templates, your content, your playlists, your groups and zones. Really, the only thing that we haven't talked about yet that matters to this process is going back over grouping and zoning, which we'll do when we get into the configuration page. So what we'll probably do is we'll look at grouping and zoning after the next break. And then after we look at grouping and zoning, we'll take a quick detour into device management. And then that should take us out through the rest of today.
One last real quick question about scripts.
Yeah, sure.
I know that we've already had this conversation, but if we are anticipating 200 or more scripts running at the same time, I think you had mentioned at one point that we may have to do something different with configuration because there's a threshold of about 200.
Yeah, there's just a straight up cap on the number. We would have to expand the size of your Cisco Vision Director's compute block, and it's not really a supported configuration. We could test it, but there's no guarantee that it would behave the way you expect it to.
So the existing threshold is 200?
No, it's something like 250, I think. But I can confirm that for you.
Okay.
Yeah, so the idea of running independent scripts on every single suite, which I think was the discussion, it's just not a typical or supported configuration in Cisco Vision, really. And in particular, so the other thing to remember is the expectation will probably be that you have another couple of dozen scripts that are running just for your actual game day operations, right? You'll have what's running for menu boards, you'll have what's running for club spaces, you'll have what's running for suites. Even you take suites out of it, you probably are talking about like, you know, between 5 to 12 scripts to run your game day rundown. And then if you add on top of that, you know, hundreds of individual suites for scripts for suites, it'll be very hard, A, to manage, and B, it's probably going to exceed what the system is capable of doing. I almost guarantee you that it hasn't been tested in that configuration. We'd have to do it to see if it worked, and that's, yeah.
Could we utilize the channel guide feature to, hold on, let me think about this.
So that was one of the things we talked about when we went through this. So just to give you some context here, there was a request to do custom sponsorship content in every single suite and make it so that the suite holders could either choose to show that content or hide that content at their local control point. So one of the ideas that we talked about, every suite has a unique channel guide, or can have a unique channel guide. It doesn't today, but could very easily be done. And the system will support as many unique channel guides as you want. The media players for the suites are already in their own control units, luxury suites, and it's in the config stuff that we're going to talk about in a little bit. So each of those control groups can have its own channel guide, which means if you use URL-based content, right, you could just put that in the specific unique channel guide for that suite. And that would resolve the issue. There'd be no scripting requirements because whatever the web-hosted content was would just be their channel. They'd tune to it, they'd tune away from it. If we start talking about putting it into scripts, it's actually an additional step, more complicated even than that, because there'd be a content is running, content is not running, which means every individual Crestron panel would have to be able to send a unique trigger to turn the content on for that space. And then if they tune the channel away on the Crestron, it would actually have to do two things. It would have to send a trigger to move them away from that content and then also change the channel so that the script would be no longer on that same state, because you can't re-trigger the same state in the script while you're on that state in the script. So that's getting into a very particular workflow, but in general, from basic scripting to really the advanced operations stuff that we just covered, do you guys have any questions about what we've done so far? Okay, cool. So I think we're going to take 15, and then when we come back, we're going to start by jumping into groups and zones, and then after we finish groups and zones, we will do a deep dive into the device management tab.